response to a video that was recommended to me through YouTube, specifically Tim Walz giving ICE the benefit of the doubt, to which Socialism for All says what collaborating with fascism looks like. And this raises an important issue regarding capital, insofar as it has an inherently vampiric function that feeds on labor more broadly. And while it affects different groups differently, insofar as certain groups have more rights or less rights depending, their vampiric function is something that is maintained over time. And the facilitators of said function for the owner class are class traders among the working class. Cops. There are good cops and bad, but there are also different levels of cops. You have those on the ground, at the very bottom. You have those that are more like middle management, and then those closer to the top. And despite what people like to think about Tim Walz, he is a cop. A governor is essentially a cop on the top, or closer to the top, who facilitates the vampiric feeding function of capital that cops beneath him facilitate. He facilitates, they facilitate, and the state goes on feeding. And the establishment process that he is tied to is meant to disguise this particular feeding process in ways that when push comes to shove, he will attempt to preserve by either doing nothing, or in this case, saying things that help ICE feed in ways that lead to these feeding mechanisms, instead of happening in broad daylight, happen under the cloak of darkness. Insofar as, in this video, Tim Walz essentially says, oh, we should give ICE the benefit of the doubt. They're replacing so-and-so with someone else, someone who is of a cooler head and who won't kick down doors in broad daylight, but instead will do it when those they are going after least expect it, in the middle of the night. And I think in my comment I say, Waltz, a vampire to ICE, you're doing it wrong. Feed at night, you guys. And the reality of the situation is capital, through its feeding function, from Marx to us, dead labor feeding on living labor. I think classically Marx referred to factories, but we're ultimately dealing with territories of feeding that Patrick Wolfe would call structures of invasion through settler colonialism, the elimination of native populations. And in order for capital to continue moving money through nature, it needs to have a new native to exterminate. So if you move one native population out, there has to be a population to replace it, per the function of replacement that feeding occurs. So if you move out the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, and you rename the land something else, North America, and then you divide it into states with their own names and their own basic rules that follow the same principles of feeding in some shape or form, red or blue, feeding is feeding, you have to maintain the moving of money through nature that cops facilitate. And you have good cops and bad cops, but a cop is a cop, someone who betrays their class interests to feed on workers and nature through various principles, various tools of the state according to monopolies, violence, terror, and monsters, R.E. Weber, Asprey, and myself, and my research based on those men. They are effectively doing this not just according to monopolies, but qualities of capital. So you have Cartesian thought, Cartesian dualism, thinking beings versus extended beings. You have heteronormativity, the state is straight, an argument that I would make. And then you have settler colonialism, R.E. Patrick Wolfe. So these cities, or just anywhere where police exist, under capital, which is essentially everywhere. They are agents of capitalist realism that through these monopolies, through these qualities of capital, and various other things that we don't really have time to go into here, but all that being said, feeding is feeding, and feeding is capital moving money through nature, wherein the money flows up through theft of things that are taken from workers. Different workers are affected differently, but these states have cities. It's a concentric territory of invasion from federal to state to local levels, with cops at each of those levels, generally with higher up levels targeting lower levels going inwards. So from the federal government sending troops and other cop-like agents to the state level, and the state level basically letting them in some shape or form, which by giving ICE the benefit of the doubt, Tim Walz is exposing a function of the vampire is normally some degree cloaked, because Walz is presented as affable within a blue state. He never do anything like that, but at the end of the day, he's helping facilitate it by literally giving them advice. And that brings me to the point of this video, is that through these concentric routine territories or structures of invasion, vis-a-vis Patrick Wolfe, feeding is something that is facilitated through blue state and red state alike, through good cop and bad cop, through Republican or Democrat, governor, senator, representative, what have you. Every aspect of government is basically part of a larger police state through settler colonialism, and you see that maintained through this feeding mechanism that Tim Walz is helping facilitate as normal. He's not trying to abolish ICE, he's trying to reform them, to teach them how to feed in ways that is expanding the mechanism of feeding within the territories thereof, to treat various people who once upon a time were relatively privileged to be fed on. And it doesn't just affect white people, of course, because as it expands to affect people who normally have more privilege, it's also at the same time affecting those who have been fed on this entire time in ways that become more aggressive. So just because white people are experiencing things that people of color experience all the time doesn't mean that things can't get worse for people of color too. It is a rising tide raises all ships, except in this case it's a negative thing. And sinking tide lowers all ships, I guess you could say, keeping with the vampirism metaphor, sucking the ocean dry, that kind of thing. And I basically want to remind people then that we can't reform ICE, we have to abolish ICE, but we also have to abolish the state. See, I'm an anarcho-communist, I'm not a Marxist-Leninist, and Marxist-Leninism is something that through my own writings I've critiqued as well. So I'll have a link in the description to my most recent essays that talk about this function. A lot of my work is 18 and up, so YouTube doesn't generally let me share it, but in this case, I can share a couple of my more recent essays, which I've written to be shareable. And shareable on YouTube, that is. And this vampiric function is something that we combat as workers through collective labor action that targets not just the police, not just one branch of the police, ICE, effectively, but all aspects thereof, including abolishing state mechanisms that when it comes time to feed more, when empire decays and it sets its feeding mechanisms on the current native population, where it starts feeding on various people who are not native to the land but are being treated as natives to exterminate, to replace, because people have to remember that this applies to white people, of course, but it also applies to immigrants, so brown people. It also applies to black people who were taken from Africa and various territories through the Middle Passage to America. They're not native to this island either, Turtle Island. So as far as that goes, all of them are being effectively treated the same way that the natives were. They are being treated as indigenous, as of nature, or thinking beings per an enlightened mode of thought, can exterminate them behind a veneer of reason, and in this case, Pax Americana. So we have to abolish the state as a feeding mechanism. R.E. Marx, dead labor. It is a territory or structure of invasion that through various qualities of capital and monopolies, workers have to fight against those monopolies by challenging them and by upending what Kristeva would call the process of abjection, and that I, in furtherance of that, would describe nature as monstrous feminine, pimps, whores. Nature and those of it, workers, the rabble, masses, are basically stuck between a state of contradictions where they are either friend or foe to the state if they lick the boot or not. And yet, in doing that, they allow the state to feed on them, as the master vampire classically does. He feeds on his thralls, his slaves, his prey more broadly, of which his thralls are. So, keeping all of this in mind, Tim Walz is a smaller vampire than, say, the President of the United States and his cronies at the top in Washington, but at the end of the day, he's a governor that is facilitating the feeding mechanism of ICE in ways that illustrate quite succinctly, I think, why we need to abolish ICE, but also those that created them. The state. The state needs to be abolished, which ultimately jives with Marx. And this can't be done with imperialism. This can't be done with Marxist-Leninism, which feeds on its own population too. You fight fire with fire to such a degree that you essentially become your enemy. It's self-defeating, Nietzsche, right? And with us, we take the language of monsters and we do it in such a way that we actually dismantle the state within itself. Like, you don't just usher in a dictatorship of the proletariat because they feed too. And again, refer to my links in the description where I talk about state feeding mechanisms and anarcho-communism versus Marxist-Leninism. There are different ways that you can approach the same problem, and historically Marxist-Leninism is prone to its own issues of feeding on its population, targeting women, queer people in particular. Capital sucks. And Marxist-Leninism is still a form of capital because you still have billionaires. You still have the heads of state. Not so different from a governor or a president, some kind of executive. It doesn't matter how they present themselves. Like the Maoist or Stalinist idea of, not having a lot of material possessions, there's still a tremendous power imbalance. The whole point of anarcho anything is that it's horizontally arranged, but anarcho-communism, power is arranged horizontally instead of vertically. There's no longer a pyramid structure. The pyramid structures are vampiric by design. R.E. Marx is dead labor. And in this case, you have traitors elected from the working class, Tim Walz, who now serve the bourgeoisie, having bourgeoisie or vampiric feeding qualities. And we have to take that back ourselves by reversing the abjection process, by reversing the flow of power that is normally siphoned from us through these territories of invasion that cities, states, nation states ultimately represent through state governance. It has to be something that we deconstruct within itself. We can't go outside it and fight it somewhere else. It's just not practical. And if we submit one master for another, say a openly capitalist state for a Marxist-Leninist state, it's ultimately going to lead to similar issues because it has historically. Just look at the Soviets, look at the Chinese, and it's not something where they have effectively stopped abusing their own populations. They just do it to a different matter of degree, a different flavor of feeding. So, in any event, this is me just kind of jabbering about why we need to abolish ICE, why we need to be leery of and be able to recognize state feeding in all of its forms, even when it attempts to disguise itself, despite the fact that Tim Walz here is very openly stating, hey, you can do this in a way that won't worry the masses, that won't rouse the rabble. So this is a very old ethnocentric function. He may as well be like a governor over a colonial territory in the 1700s, say, in America, talking to someone about how not to upset the colonists that are being fed on by police forces. Imagine the same ideas being practiced back then that are still being practiced today. against all manner of populations. Within Minneapolis in particular is a melting pot of different immigrant populations, of native populations, of white people, black people, Native Americans, and indigenous people, and brown people. All sorts of different people live here, but they all suffer under the boot or yoke of the state, which it's literally Tim Walz's job to arbitrate, and that's what he's doing here, and we have to meet him in kind. So in any event, abolish ICE, abolish the state, abolish capital. We have to do all of these things simultaneously, and this has to be done through protests around the nation, in particular, just keeping things locally within America's borders. But it should be happening around the world because capital is a worldwide thing. Ergo fascism, ergo Western liberalism, disguising fascism, two sides of the same coin. So protest and labor action have to become endemic. They have to become something that happens everywhere as much as possible to disrupt state feeding. The more you disrupt that, the more you can make demands. The weaker the state gets. The more desperate it gets, the more it will attempt to continue its feeding through force, which they expose themselves in the very ways that Tim Walz is trying to discourage. So you can basically force their hand through collective labor action, which is non-violent, but capable of making demands through labor action as something that can be organized, that can snowball. But you can't scapegoat capital. You can't just be like, well, we kicked out Bovino, so it's all good, or we got rid of Trump, because at the end of the day, Walz and Obama and Biden and various other Democrats, past and present, helped facilitate the formation of ICE. It formed originally, if I understand, under the Bush administration, but there were changes in the government before that under Clinton, and the so-called end of history, where things effectively dovetailed into the war on terror as unavoidable. This happened under a so-called period of economic prosperity that would continue, where history would just never improve anymore because it was a solidification of a current economic order, and that would never change. And things only continue to get worse. Things got worse because capital decays, and capital under the so-called end of history after the Cold War just continued to decay through capital sinking its fangs into itself, because that's what the bourgeoisie do. They need someone to feed on. So eliminating enemies abroad only necessitated the creation of enemies closer at home, and abroad as well, obviously, with the war on terror. But the Patriot Act was something that also targeted American citizens, and initially brown people, Muslims, of course, but the same principles and abuses of police power also affect white people, black people, indigenous peoples, and various other minorities and marginalities intersecting, disabled people, queer people, feminists, political dissidents more broadly. So these are issues that were facilitated by both wings of the same bird, the Democrats and the Republicans. This is endemic to establishment politics through the state. And even if you had, a Marxist-Leninist party, I imagine they could probably reduce the feeding of that, but eventually you have to move away from that as well. So why not do it at the start? And the Marxist-Leninists will tell you, oh, no, you can't do that. It's not possible. Did you know that anarcho-communists can't organize? Apparently, we're just dumb Eloi, and we need some kind of savior from the Marxist-Leninist school of thought to come and save us. So I don't know. I've done a lot of work regarding Marxist-Leninism and its own tendencies to feed and basically point the finger at anarchists and blame us and call us like social democrats, even though I'm not a social democrat. I'm against the state. I'm against the idea of democracy as it's advertised in the West as being routinely built on genocide, on slavery, all the way back to ancient Athens. It is largely an illusion that's used to conceal the usual mechanisms of slavery, ergo feeding, that affects people regardless of skin color. It affected women in ancient Athens, for instance. It affected people in Rome. Either you were a Roman or you were a barbarian, you were a slave, you were one or the other. And, the racial mechanisms were something that were introduced later, and there are various other qualities thereof that it's an intersectional problem, and it demands intersectional solutions in a holistic way that I think anarcho-communism is best equipped to deliver. But that's, part of a larger conversation, and you can read all about that in the research that I'll plug in the description of this video. All that being said, I do think that Marxist-Leninism isn't like some kind of monolith. Not everyone's going to apologize for Stalin. Not everyone is going to apologize for Mao. And there are plenty of useful principles within Marxist-Leninism. You can take ideas from Stalin, despite the fact that he was responsible for a large number of deaths through the purges and terrors, let alone when he sided with Hitler. And you can make all these arguments, we had to do it to prepare for invasion. Operation Barbarossa was ultimately doomed to happen. But at the end of the day, he still teamed up with Hitler until then, and he conducted imperialism in the interim. After Hitler was done and dusted, it was rinse and repeat, and they conducted imperialism elsewhere, and they caused various famines and killed large numbers of people. So the Soviet state was never something that could do away with its own imperial function too. And that being said, there's room to critique them as well, and basically take the same principles that I'm applying to any configuration of state power, because the Marxist-Leninists believe that you can basically solve all your problems through a dictatorship of the proletariat. This goes all the way back to Lenin and Stalin. Stalin was Lenin's chosen successor, and he was a dictator of the proletariat, and they believed that that was the only way that you could do it. And in my opinion, that's bullshit, especially coming from the perspective of women and queer people who were sold out by their own, who were criminalized, who were put back into the kitchen, who were put back into the closet repeatedly, I might add, especially as far as queer people go. The state is constantly, pardon the expression, but an Indian giver, where they give something and they take it back again. And so workers have to do it amongst ourselves in ways that avoid not just the predation of people like Tim Walz, but people whose solutions historically are band-aids at best, or they lead to similar problems dressed up as something else. You had that with the Nazis, the National Socialists, but you also had it with the Soviets, who called themselves communists, but they also weren't communists, because communism has never been something that is achieved, and you could argue that there were socialist practices, but there were also reactionary practices that were essentially akin to fascism in function. So you have to go according to function with these kinds of things. And just as I critique Marxist-Leninism, you can also critique Tim Walz and other people who use similar veils and language of Western liberalism is a veil just like the veils and feeding mechanisms of Soviet Russia, of China, of various peoples, places, and ideologies that all have similar feeding mechanisms. And again, there is a lot of work that I've done based on other people who have critiqued Marxist-Leninism and Pax Americana and Western capitalism side by side. They're not that different from each other ultimately. They still conduct imperialism, and if they conduct imperialism, they have police. The Soviets had police, secret police. America has police, and there's a secret sort of grim function to that you can see on both sides of the ocean across space and time, dating back thousands of years. The czars would have had their own instances of that, and if you go back to, say, Sparta, they had the Crypteia, or a secret police that conducted slavery. Someone is always the slave. Someone is always the master. So we have to push away from that in ways that actually take Marx Marx up on his offer, a stateless, classless, moneyless society. You don't want to kick the can down the road, as Marxist-Leninists like to do, and say, well, let's just trade one dictator for another and hope it works. And you could argue that, all right, this is a long game, it's going to take centuries, but at the end of the day, the Soviets decayed into the Russian Federation and only continued to do what they're doing, and they continued to operate and make deals with the United States, with the Ukraine, fighting over pieces of meat to feed on. I think that we can do better than that, and we can actually put power into the hands of workers instead of into the hands of the state, which is designed to feed on workers in nature by design, regardless if you call yourself American or Western or Soviet, Russian, communist on the tin. You know, it's nominal. And that's something that we have to actually make communist through function. And my approach in my school of criticism that targets a wide variety of feeders, maintaining a capital or a state function through productivity or profit, through various monopolies and various qualities thereof. The state is straight, and that is aptly illustrated in the Soviet Union, for instance, because in their case, they are incredibly queer-phobic. They commonly targeted homosexual men, of course, but they also targeted other groups as well, and they did it alongside the Nazis, for instance, where Hitler burned down Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute of Sexology in 1933, and Stalin and company made queerness, specifically homosexuality, illegal again, reinstituting czarist principles that the Bolsheviks had supposedly overthrown. You know, so if they're just going to reinstitute things like that, then they're not really any different from the white man in the West making treaties with various peoples that they stab in the back. Where, oh yeah, let's give you this, the cunning recognition of this or that we can then take away again. Well, if you can just take it away, what's the point? You know, the state betrays by design. Tim Walz is betraying his people, just as Stalin betrayed plenty of his own, to hold on to power. That's what all of this is to maintain the pyramid, the vertical arrangement of power, to continue feeding for the bourgeoisie. It happens in the East, it happens in the West. So, yeah, sorry, there's a lot of extra stuff there. There's a lot to unpack, and partly I'm saying that because socialism for all intensify class struggle, and I'm like, dude, you also have to intersect it with struggles of class and race. It's not just a class thing. It's not just class consciousness, but it's intersectional consciousness through holistic application, which Marxist-Leninism sometimes tends to abjure through class reductionism. Working men of all countries unite, specifically Western countries and factory workers, right, Engels? You know, so we have to expand beyond that in ways that Marxist-Leninism historically has been kind of myopic about. I mean to make this a video critiquing, you know, socialism, but we have to critique socialism because socialism is often something that is waved about in ways, well, don't worry, we're doing socialism right now. Because you get like socialism light with Mamdani and people like that who might sloganize or pay lip service to what we obviously should do from the very beginning. You don't want to wait for the state to do it. You don't want to wait for establishment politics to do it, for elected officials. Workers have to organize and do it amongst themselves. And at the core of that is anarcho-communism. The key to combating state feeding is anarchist and communist. If you want to get to a stateless, classless, moneyless, raceless society where queer people are allowed to exist in all shapes and forms, and we're not reduced to men and women in a cis heteronormative binary, then you're going to have to do it yourselves, because the state will always treat that as something to kick down the road while continuing to feed on people as normal, while paying lip service and saying, oh, don't worry, we fired someone, but we're going to keep feeding on you in the dead of the night, feeding on you when you're not aware. So these are all traitors, and traitors that we can critique, pull down their masks and expose them for the vampires that they are, while, you know, employing a vampire aesthetic ourselves. You know, if they feed in one direction, we feed anisotropically in the other. So there's no monopoly on any of these things, and they function in duality by sharing the same stages, the same aesthetic, the same costumes. different actors depending on states' rights versus worker rights. And again, that's something that anarcho-communism, as I employ it, Gothic, gay-anarcho-communism, again, I'll link my book series on Gothic, gay-anarcho-communism in the description. There's a lot more that you can learn about. My focus is unpaid labor, which tends to be excluded from revolutionary action, but it is something that is routinely excluded from dialogues of revolutionary action, commonly by Marxist-Leninists, who tend to be white straight guys anyways. And I'm like, no, we have to intersect in ways that historically anarcho-communism is much more conducive towards, I think, if we want to critique state feeding mechanisms on all registers in any territory around the globe to combat ultimately capitalist realism, the process of objection, and all of the aforementioned monopolies that I've rattled off. So, keeping all of that in mind, abolish ICE, abolish the state, abolish capital, and that can only be done in solidarity. So, solidarity indeed. Stay safe out there and continue organizing and pushing so that this kind of thing doesn't just give in to the first amount of lip service that's paid at the first hurdle. We have to keep going, and it has to keep growing. And workers have to continue to unify and challenge the state everywhere year-round. Good luck, stay safe out there, and until next time.